I'm very pleased and also honored and delighted to introduce our two presenters, Thomas Hübl and Brian Swimme. Thomas Hübl is a teacher, author, and founder of the Academy of Inner Science. His teaching integrates the core insights of the great wisdom traditions with the discoveries of contemporary science, illuminating both with his profound understanding. Thomas's work combines somatic awareness practices, advanced meditative practices, and transformational processes that address both individual and collective trauma, opening the potential for growth and healing. Brian Thomas Swimme received his PhD from the Department of Mathematics at the University of Oregon in 1978 for work in gravitational dynamics. He is currently a professor in the School of Consciousness and Transformation at California Institute of Integral Studies. Brian is the author of The Hidden Heart of the Cosmos and The Universe is a Green Dragon. He brings the context of story to our understanding of the 14 billion year trajectory of the universe. Such a story, he feels, will assist in the emergence of a flourishing Earth community. So we're in two extremely skilled, experienced, heartfelt people for today's conversation. I'm very delighted now to pass over to Thomas to start us off.
Well, thank you, Robin, and I'm happy to be here with you, Brian. And before we go into our dialogue, welcome everybody. There are many thousands of people tuning in right now from around the world. And let's say the good news first. Today we're going to talk a lot about collective trauma. But right now, we want to address that we are the remedy. So we are actually the healing of collective trauma through presence and relation, mainly. And since we are now tuning in from all around the world here into this space, it seems like a virtual space. Everybody is sitting at home. We can't see each other. And at the same time, we are also in each other's presence. And maybe before we start our dialogue, Brian and I, maybe we can just take a minute to sense into the field that we are right now. Everybody's intention to tune into this conversation, like the interest that drives us to be part of this conversation, is like a plug-in. So we have thousands of plugins that connect to this mutual space. And I can just, by setting the intention that I want to sense and feel into this kind of collective container, it's the kind of a collective coherence. All our nervous systems, our bodies, our beings create a mutual container. And if we do that intentionally, and I think that's also what we're going to talk about later when we talk about collective trauma healing, it's that coherence between us that is an extremely powerful function of human consciousness. And so just to take a moment to feel into thousands of people around the world and of being part of this moment and creating a space that we're going to fill together at first through the dialogue between Brian and I, and then through your participation if you wish to, through questions and statements. Right. Great. So thank you for this moment of attunement, and hello, Brian. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Likewise.
Mm-hmm. So maybe I hand it over to you to start us off.
Well, thank you, Thomas. Yes, I thought we would start off with maybe some words from you about how you found your way into collective trauma, and even just so we can include everyone, what is trauma?
Right. Yeah, I think and that's also good news, that the knowledge of trauma, I mean, through many pioneers that's really worked on this for for decades, we become more and more knowledgeable, actually, how fundamental traumatic impacts are in our lives. And so when we talk about trauma, many people might think of trauma as severe events like car accidents or wars or very abusive situations. But actually, trauma starts way earlier, and during our kind of upbringing, the attachment process is a very complex and also fragile process. So trauma is not only severe impacts, but it's severe impacts that might not be noticed as such. So there is the trauma that happens in our kind of whole attachment and developmental process. There's, of course, shock trauma and traumatic events like they happen in wars and violent situations. And that's, I think, what we're going to explore today. There is ancestral trauma and there is collective trauma. And so trauma is, in a way, not the experience that we have, but trauma is what happens in us in relation to that overwhelming experience. So I experience something that is too much for me to process. And then I take that overwhelm, and my nervous system learned over thousands of years, because we're not the first ones to experience trauma, to split that off, numb that part. And here is a lot of stress. So I often refer to it as you have a TV and you see kind of a crazy scene in a movie, and it's loud, and then you take the remote control and you mute it. And it's still going on, but it's kind of quiet. And then you take that TV and you throw it in the ocean. And it still continues. And you see it sinking into the dark of the deep ocean. And collective trauma is basically the diving into the ocean and seeing millions and millions of TVs. And their movies are still playing, but we don't see them and we don't hear them. But the whole process is still going on. So that's one way. And then the other, maybe short answer to that question is that it's very important when we think about collective trauma for us to see our own life in the context of hundreds of thousands, and maybe the way you wrote in your book, maybe almost 14 billion years. Like we are living in a context, and that context means that when I land here in this life, I'm landing in a pre-traumatized world. So many symptoms and many effects that trauma has, for me, might be normal. I might say, oh, that's how life is. That's how the world is. And that's why maybe some of the collective aspects, because my parents were partly traumatized, my teachers, the society around me. So I grew up and I learned about life through a partly traumatized world. And that's why, and I think that's what we're going to explore a bit today, what are the structures in our societies and cultures and interiors and exteriors that are actually trauma structures that we might not even notice as such. So maybe that's just for the beginning, a short overview.
Great, thanks. I would like to begin placing the whole notion of collective trauma in the context of the universe. And I think this helps, but I'd be curious in your own response. So the my sense is that remedies are become more apparent if we see the larger meaning of the collective trauma in which we live. So the context in which we find ourselves is a universe that has evolved over 14 billion years, and the amazing thing is that the universe from the beginning is aiming at community. So it is, just to give one example of this, if you look at the plasma at the beginning of time, the interactions of the elementary particles, their strengths, right, their proclivities, even back then, the universe was set upon creating stars and planets. So the universe has a direction. And so then when we go to we look at our own planet Earth, we have this amazing discovery that we began as molten rock, right? Then the atmosphere came forth, and the oceans, and then life. And life itself, now, life existed for billions of years as single cells. And yet then, through this process of creative evolution, these single cells joined together and became animals and plants. So you see, I think, and others think, that the moment we are in right now is like the development of the first multicellular organisms. The universe is trying to find a way to create a unified humanity, and it would be the emergence of a profoundly intimate global humanity with the, as you say, a deep relationship, one part to the other. And now, but so this is a complex process for sure, but collective trauma is blocking this. Collective trauma is keeping us fragmented. And that one of the things, when we were preparing for this dialogue, Thomas, one of the things you said that I thought was so important is that what we experience within is what is leading to our feeling distant and feeling apart and separate. So that the collective trauma and the refusal to enter more deeply, or the lack of power or capacity to enter into deeper relationships, they all go together. So I would love to hear your own response to that placement of collective trauma in terms of what the universe really is about.
It's beautiful, and as you said, it's when we see like relation. Let's talk a little bit about relation, because in order to create a unified community, like there is relation and there is information. I love the word information. Every human being and every plant, every animal is a form. And in order to keep this form, we need to stay informed. And how do we stay informed? We stay informed inside and through relation with the world. We stay informed and we can update ourselves moment to moment to moment. Now, what we know about trauma is that trauma, in a way, creates a dissonance and interference. And as you said beautifully, the main trauma symptom is separation. That we feel separate. when in fact, everybody is part of. So it creates the feeling as if I was like on the game board, and we hear it in many conversations, look like the system is like this. But where does it put me when I talk like that? Where am I when the system is like this? So it implies that I'm outside of that system looking at it. And that's not true. But that's true in trauma. And so we have many ways how actually that fundamental notion of separation designs our cultures and societies, designs our thinking, because that separation is also true between my mind, my emotions, my body. We often say when mind and heart are not synchronized, but often we experience that actually there are cracks. Like I often refer to trauma like a broken window. You see the cracks. And the cracks became so normal that, and I often say, Adobe was not the one that invented Photoshop, really. Our brain invented Photoshop already way earlier, thousands of years ago. We knew that the trauma cracks are so fundamental, and then the brain goes and erases the incongruences so that we can live. But actually, there's a lot of information that I cannot experience because I have these filter systems of individual, ancestral, and collective trauma built into my perception. So when I see you, Brian, I don't know if what I see and feel is really who you are. The only way to find out is through resonance. And so the universe, in a way, learns in a way through, in our human experience at least, it learns through resonance. That's the language beyond all languages, is resonance. But if resonance is kind of disturbed or broken down, then I need to go. So if I cannot feel you directly, I need to go to my hard drive and I need to look for files, Brian files, because I say, my mind tells me, I know Brian. So if I cannot feel him, I just go and look who he is. Oh, he is this very lovely, warm-hearted man that I really like. So I can bridge my inability to stream you in the moment, like data streaming, and I go to my hard drive and I look at the movie of Brian. But that's not who you are, and I will miss you. So what I'm saying is, as you said, through collective trauma, we are living in an unseen fragmentation, first of all. There's a fragmentation in our society, in our inner individual experiences, and in the societal experience, or also ways of acting and behaving and speaking and many, many things that actually unconsciously transmit splits, fragmentations. And those fragmentations might be normal because we say, yeah, it's normal that people are so polarized. It's normal that that's the world. And I would say, no, that's not the world. That's the world when it's hurt. Because once we can call the things as they really are by their name, then we at least know what we are talking about and say, okay, let's say part of our world is hurt. And let's recognize where the world's hurt and where the world's not hurt. And then I believe when you said the universe is moving into a direction, as long as I feel that drive of the universe, it's beautiful, because there's some people call it the creative force of the universe, of the divine, like there is a movement. But if I feel separate from it, then I doubt that power. I feel disconnected from it, and I might not be anymore so informed by that power.
Mm.
All right.
Nice. I love that. I love that. I love the whole image of dragging the files out, as opposed to entering into resonance, deep, real resonance. We have these files, and that's what we're living, really, and repeating them over and over again. It reminds me of one of the things I learned from Thomas Berry, and his way of talking about those files was to say that that we all have a fundamental cosmology. Now, looking at the way we relate to one another and to the universe as a whole. And he called it the use cosmology, use. So that it, like the file we take out is, well, the planet, for instance, is just there for our use, right? So that the file tells us that the Earth is like a gravel pit or a hardware store. It's just this stuff we can use any way we want. But it doesn't just end with the Earth. It's how we relate to other groups of people, or maybe even all humans, right? So then this it's a file of separation, and it's interesting that Thomas Berry also rooted this in hurt, and the hurt he identified historically was actually the Black Death. So it so traumatized the human being that we've been living with that collective trauma nonstop. So so how to enter into deeper resonance with how things really are. I just have this image I want to again tell you about, and just see what your response is, so that the basic cosmology of use says that everything is an object. The universe is an object. So we keep this distance. It's just objects. Now, but here's the amazing discovery. Scientists, by paying attention, careful attention to the stars, came to understand that those stars out there actually constructed all of the atoms of our body. So we have every carbon atom, every phosphorus atom, every calcium atom of our body was constructed by the stars. Now, so just imagine what this means. Now, when we look out at the stars, we're not looking at objects out there. We are actually looking at the process that gave birth to our looking. That process led to the development of eyes and brains. So to me, it's the most stunning insight. We're looking at that which constructed us. So we can even say this. We can even say, if you think of the process of the universe, we are looking out at that which is looking. You see, so that we realize that we are actually composed of the creative energy that gave birth to those stars. You see, so like you're saying, the hurt that keeps us separate and objectifies everything is keeping us from realizing that we are the creative energy of the universe itself.
That's so beautiful. Fantastic. And I was going to say before already that two things come to mind when you say that. One is more planetary global, and one is maybe bigger than that. So in my understanding of trauma and working with many, many people and groups around the world, so one of the fundamental trauma symptoms is that information cannot flow properly, which means parts of my body, for example, are networks. If you imagine a city at night and you're on a plane, I mean, less nowadays, but if you're on a plane, and then you're looking down at the city, and the city has a power cut in 1/4, let's say, of the city. So the city is dark, but there is still city. So something is going on there in that part of the city, but seen from the plane perspective, I can't tell what. let's say my nervous system, where it's traumatized and numbed, I, as the subject, don't feel what's happening in my body in that area. So I know, I would say, oh, I feel my body. Yes, I feel my body, but I don't know what I don't feel. I see it only through symptoms. So my body shows me signs of any kind of symptoms. And then I say, oh, wow, how come that I have that? But how come that I have that means that I don't feel myself. That's why I ask myself about the most immediate experience that I have. When I ask about my body, I use my mind to ask about something that I'm supposed to feel. So I'm actually looking at myself from my mind, figuring out why is that part of my body hurting. But I'm supposed to feel that directly, not indirectly through thinking. So the level of disembodiment in the world, as I see it, is way higher than we expect. So the parts of our bodies, and then I'm often saying we are not living in an individual nervous system. You know, in the anatomy class, you go and you see the nervous system, the brain and the spine, and then you say, oh, that's an individual. No, I'd say the nervous system is transpersonal, and the individual is a sculpture within a transpersonal nervous system. So my experience of nature, in a certain degree of disembodiment, when I don't feel my body, I don't feel the closest part of nature, which is the carbon and the water and the minerals and the metals, are the planet. You know, I am animated planet. The substance of my body didn't come from somewhere. It came from the planet. And so we are actually, through the trauma disembodiment, we see the planet as other, and then exactly what you said, it becomes like an object, not an interrelated and interdependent field, world, net of life, web of life. So that's one thing. So I totally agree that the reason, the numbness, and let's say our ancestors and everything they experienced, the tree of our ancestors, back when we follow it back, we come back to the cells that you mentioned before. We come back to the plasma. We come back, like when I really feel back, but all the trauma fields, like the Second World War, racism, all kinds of genocides, wars around the world, are big blank spots with a lot of pain covered in nothing, the end of the conscious world. And so when we experience ourselves as separate, it means that we lost the connection to what informs us. And that's why we go out of form. Physically, the cells in our bodies often go out of form because they don't get the cell reception in the trauma field. And our societies sometimes go out of form or partly out of form, so that we call it dysfunction. But that dysfunction is a function somewhere that I don't understand. And the second response to we are looking at that which is looking, that we say, I often say, presence is exactly what's happening. And that's very deep. It's not only this moment in time. At presence, when there is a traumatic event, we split off a bubble of energy that we cannot digest in this moment. That is the past. Unintegrated history is the past. And in the moment that happens, it creates a future, but that future is not true. That is the future that I'm dreaming about when I cannot be present. Because the real future is being born out of presence. And in presence, I feel interrelated with the whole universe. So that which is looking, and my looking is not two.
Yeah.
But in the trauma, it feels like separate objects and separate in time.
Yeah.
But that time is not a real time. But it's a trauma symptom that our societies live in. This kind of future is part of the repetitive patterns that we all know How often do you have the same conversation with your husband or your wife, the same conflicts, the same experiences, traumatic events, the same fears, the same thoughts, the same like repetitive patterns? You take the highway that you drove on yesterday, you put it in front of you, and you drive it again. And then we call that future. And that's not the future, that's the past. So once the world is split in that way, we are not talking anymore about the, as you beautifully said, the direction of the universe. There is our future. That's the higher consciousness. That's the information that brings innovation, genius breakthroughs, real evolutionary steps. The other part, we are prisoners of time. And so these are the two things that come to my mind as you speak.
I love that. I love the prisoners of time. I love that, and also the idea of these things are frozen. You started with, and prisoner. Who wants to be a prisoner of time? I mean, that's a great phrase. What it brings to mind is this: that the trauma is actually a feature of the universe itself, and as you know, and I one of the most traumatic experiences that can happen at the galactic scale is for a galaxy to lose its structure. So the spiral galaxies can create new stars. And then sometimes that structure is lost, it's destroyed, and it becomes frozen, just like you were saying, frozen in a state that has lost the capacity to create stars. So, I mean, that's the ultimate trauma for a galaxy, because that means then that the stars that exist, that's it. One by one, they're going to burn out, and then it's over. But so here's this amazing discovery. The Large Magellanic Cloud, it's a small galaxy that billions of years ago suffered a major trauma, and it lost its spiral structure and became frozen. Now, get this. Then it drifted for billions of years, and then it entered into a relationship with the Milky Way. It is now circling the Milky Way. But you see, so this goes back to your point about presence and relationship. So now the Large Magellanic Cloud entered into relationship with the Milky Way galaxy. The relationship is gravitational, but you see, it penetrates right into the system and changes it. And after a certain period of time, the Large Magellanic Cloud began creating stars again.
That's amazing.
Isn't that amazing?
That's amazing.
It's amazing. It was, just like you were saying, it was frozen. Those capacities were frozen, and then in this relationship, they came alive again.
Amazing. Brian, that's amazing. So first of all, thank you for this. It's really inspiring. And you said a few things that I want to relate to our human experience. So you said, when in the moment I become disconnected from that creative force that brings forth my creativity or the galaxy's creativity to birth new stars, I become old. Aging is not a matter of time. Every human being, in my understanding, is always at the right age. Age, like if I'm 50, 60, 70, 80, that's not age. Aging is when I get old, is when I get disconnected more and more from the creative drive that drives the universe.
Love it.
So that's amazing. Yeah. And then we have vertical connection. So that's from the integrated history of humanity is presence. These are the structures of consciousness that we use right now to have this conversation. And at the same time, the higher future, higher consciousness downloads itself, maybe bit by bit, also through this conversation. And we learn something new together, and it's inspiring to both of us. So that's a learning, a vertical learning, but that's transmitted through our horizontal relation. Horizontal means 2020, and human to human, through our heart. But we need the relation to the world to update ourselves. But frozen trauma areas, they don't update themselves. The 3-year-old, when a person was 3-year-old and traumatized, the trauma still lives at the age of 3 as a prisoner or hostage in time. And the updates of the human being don't reach that frozen area. But appropriate relation, I often say, the specificity in relation, precision is love. In the moment I can relate to somebody that expresses a trauma symptom in an appropriate way and don't take the trauma reactions as personal, I can actually become a bridge to support a growth. So the galaxy that was frozen, that can start to become creative again. But that's also true that for, let's say, Germany 1940 or 1942, there's a huge file in the collective unconscious that through appropriate relation of collective fields of people, because we did some very big collective healing events, so that through attuning to that file, that's not only true in individual trauma work where we meet and support the release of trauma, the deep, I think, but we can do the same for our collectives. Like the history of slavery in the US, or the Native American genocide, or the North-South War, or any fragmentation that still rests in the collective unconscious, or the immigration history, or the Second World War and the Holocaust. I'm just mentioning a few because the whole planet's full of them. That through appropriate relation, either as individuals or collectives, to our collective legacy, actually enables us to have a new future. And that's very powerful. That's exactly like the collective trauma healing on the planet, is in a way that you related to the galaxies. But it's a beautiful example, because we see that once we melt the ice, life is living out of the generator. It's like, I often say, there's a river. Let's say there's a river and water is flowing and snowflakes fall into water, so they melt and they become water. But snowflakes falling on iced over rivers, the snow piles up. So after a certain time, follow-up experiences on traumatic areas cannot be digested and pile up and create a sandwich layer of stress and numbness and repetition. It piles up. But experiences where we are open and related just become part of the river of the universe and stay creative. And so it's a beautiful analogy. So I didn't know what you shared before. I didn't know that, but it's very inspiring. It's very lovely.
Thank you. Yeah, it just blew my mind when I read about it. And I love that image that you just gave of the snow piling up, right? Mm-hmm. And but if there is like an intimate relationship that melts and holds, then there is a movement forward. I love that. Mm-hmm. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was about the how to think of trauma from a cosmological point of view. So, and I had a way of introducing this. Oh yes, yeah, I remember now. So, one of the biggest traumas that the planet has experienced was, it's called oxygen poisoning. So around 2 billion years ago or so, this goes with your idea of being born into a traumatized world, right? So just imagine being one of these entities that are born, they come to life, and yet there's a poison all over the entire planet, and they're immediately dying out because how do you deal with this? And there are a variety of ways of dealing with collective trauma at a planetary level. I'm going to need to. One was like massive denial, and so some of the organisms that we're talking about, unicellular organisms, single cells. Some of them just decided to dive down to the bottom of mud and hide in a place where the oxygen couldn't get to them, right? And they are still around. They survived, but they're nothing like they at one time. They were the dominant form of life. Now they're hiding out in the bottom of mud. But another response to this situation was to actually embrace the poison, and so to find a way to interact with what was really killing everything, and through that was the birth of the eukaryotic cell, a more complex cell which gave birth eventually to animals and plants. So that, in a sense, the trauma led to a creative breakthrough. There's a way of thinking about trauma, at least cosmologically, that it's linked. And I'm just wondering if in all of your deep work with trauma and collective trauma, if that is something you've discovered as well, or is it different than that?
Yeah, definitely. Like we call it trauma resilience. It's like, what do we learn? And that's also very important. It's very important what kind of precondition meets a trauma in me, and which relation am I able to create to the traumatic event itself. And that will determine the massive impact or kind of a reduced impact through my way of relating to it.
Yeah.
And so the resilience is in a way a capacity that I have enough structure, or as you said before, the worst thing for the nervous system is chaos. Like the beginning of the Bible, the tohu vabohu, like if there's chaos, we cannot keep a form. So in order to stay informed or in a form, we need to preserve a certain form. The defense pattern of our bodies and psyches and so on against overwhelming situations are actually attempts to keep us in a form, to protect the information flow and keep our development going. So that's a very powerful trauma. The trauma response is actually a very intelligent function because it preserves I call it often, it protects our contract with God. It protects our contract with the creative force of the universe, which is everybody's life purpose or flow, what we can become. We try to preserve this. Why? Because it's sacred. It's the deepest way to experience the flow, the creative expression of the universe. And so when the more I can stay connected in myself to my core and stay related as much as it's possible to the given situation, and that's in a way what you said, what survived the crisis or the poisoning is actually finding a relation to the poison and then using it for its own evolution. And that's also in the trauma healing, when we come together and we create a relation to that which was overwhelming, it becomes our fuel for evolution. That's why in every trauma there's a pearl hidden, and it becomes our fuel for evolution. Now, we also have to say that a lot of the trauma that we see in our world are the effects of the transgression of human beings of the law, the kind of the sacred law of life. So we have killed each other, we have tortured each other, we have, waged war on each other. So we have committed genocides. And that's why on a deeper level, every trauma healing, besides PTSD integration and so on, is actually the restoration of the divine law. What I call the divine law, the flow of life, how life can be transmitted in a healthy way from one generation to the next. There are principles that life developed, because we are not the first ones that do parenting. We are not the first ones that learn about, most of the things that we talk about, people thought about before us. So they are like, we are sitting on the shoulders of a giant, as we say. That there are already principles and patterns in human evolution that transmit light and consciousness from one generation to the next in healthy ways. And for example, killing disrupts it, and other transgressions. So trauma and collective trauma healing is, on the one hand, the restoration of the traumatic after effects, but then on a deeper level, it's actually what we call the judgment day, is standing nakedly in front of the divine, which means the highest presence. So when I'm undefended and the action is truly felt, there is a restoration possible. And so the process that it takes, that we call healing, is until the moment where the bubble of past and its imaginary future get unified into a not two-ness. The question and the answer become not two. And so when we go into that ethical restoration, that's in a way opening the gate in the trauma healing to that new future. The pearl of learning is that once we go there, we actually heal the trauma into the future and into the past. And that means that we learn. I often say, if we were really to integrate something severe as the Holocaust collectively, not only would it affect tremendously what happens in the Middle East, there are so many side effects that we see today in the world.
Yeah.
But I believe it's the only way that it won't happen again, because it's the learning. Because we need to deal in the ethical restoration with how come that we did it. What led up to it needs to be integrated, and not just from an intellectual distance, from a real embodied experience that outside and inside can become not two. So this means an intimacy with the root cause of the Holocaust. And that's so hard to do and hard to experience. And the way it takes us to create this intimacy is what we call the time that it needs to heal. And I believe that's why turning towards the discomfort, as you said, is actually what creates also the next step of evolution, in a resourced way, of course. Not that it overwhelms us again, but that we turn towards it as much as we can, and to walk our trauma into its healing. I think
Yeah, yeah. And like over many generations.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. You know, I wanted to say something about when we had our conversation getting ready for this. You mentioned that language is one of the ways in which we carry on the collective trauma, and so I gave it some thought, and I came up with a new word, right? But I wanted you to introduce the idea of how language, we need new language. You know, I'll give you the word I invented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yes, that's true. Like, first of all, to see like words like Googling. So when you go and Google something. So maybe 30 years ago or 40 years ago, if I came up to you and said, listen, Brian, let's Google this, you would look at me and say, what are you talking about? You know, nobody knew about it and it didn't mean anything. So today that it means something means the word is a code that is information between us, is intersubjective information that is encoded in you and in me, and we agree on its meaning. So that means the language creates an intersubjective information field that is confirmed. And because it's confirmed, my chi, my life energy, and my neuroplasticity and yours kind of confirm. It creates a net. And if billions of people do this, we have a reality that we sit in. Today, Googling means something for billions of people, most probably. And so there is a kind of a login or a lock, a language lock in between minds. There's a field where language connects our minds, like a data streaming, and we create together an intersubjective reality.
Yeah.
Now, when we pay attention, when trauma symptoms speak, there's a certain reality to our language that part of the words that we use are actually frozen ice.
Mm.
But in the moment you confirm my frozen ice language and you say yes, you actually strengthen my inner trauma landscape. And that's why,
could you give an example? I love that of frozen ice.
Yeah. For example, we can say, listen, Brian, you know, we are talking and suddenly I feel my heart is tight. And many people know, oh, my throat is closed or my muscles are tense. There's a tension, a muscle tension. I feel a pain in my shoulders. And if you say, oh, yes, a muscle tension. Okay, let's maybe, Thomas, take a massage. Mm-hmm. In that moment, you confirmed the unconscious process because I presented to you as if my heart got tight. Like, I don't know, somebody out there took the remote control, pushed a button, and because I'm not aware how I'm doing it and how I decided to tighten my experience of my heart, my chest, my throat, anything in my body. It looks like as if it's a passive process that happens to me because something in the universe happened and suddenly I feel... I didn't tell you that I had, like, I'm tensing up. Listen, Brian, we are talking and I'm tightening up my muscles because this is what it takes to control the fear that comes up in me, that also my ancestors had already because they were part of the Second World War.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't say that.
Yeah.
So the process, like here, the process was outside of the frame, and I experience something here that happens somewhere here. So that's why in the healing work, we learn to open up the map of information so that we have bigger and bigger frames of information that we include when we look at medicine, health, psychological health, societal health, because we need bigger frames of information. Otherwise, it looks like passive processes that happen to us. Yeah. And so when you confirm it, even by trying to say something nice or be compassionate, and by being unaware of my shadow language, you actually confirmed my shadow language, which confirms it in me. So then another person says yes to my unconscious. And that's why I'm often saying there is no individual unconscious. We all are co-investors in each other's shadow companies. We are all shareholders of a collective unconscious. And that's why we need to support a kind of consciousness awakening, rising conscious awareness. Otherwise, we support each other's in tendencies that are not healthy, and we even don't know that we are doing it. And so language is one way how to lock down energy in the two of us or anybody. Yeah. And once it's confirmed, it's actually harder to open up. Because I need somebody that points out, Thomas, the closing of the heart is not something that happened to you right now. It happened to you when you were 3-year-old and you got hurt and you needed to contract. So what you feel now is actually the past speaking to you. The fears that you have now are the past speaking, not now. That's why I think it's also a myth. People talk about the stress at workplace. There is no stress at the workplace. We all bring our lunch package of stress. I bring one, and then at work we share our lunch packages. And everybody, it's very stressful in my company. But we are creating this company together. And the stress that's happening there is the stress of our attachment patterns, of many other things. It's not happening in the company. Yeah. And so as long as we talk in ways where that's excluded, it's going to perpetuate itself. There's no way out.
No way out.
Yeah.
I love it. The trading ice back and forth. So so we have ways in which our language, freezes us. And so we also have to invent language and use language in a way that establishes us together in a higher and deeper understanding. Okay, so I was thinking about this, and so because the language, especially if something is rare and wonderful, it can be forgotten. But if some language is there to support it, it can be remembered and can be part of the ongoing healing process. All right, so here we go. Relationship is fundamental for the healing of collective trauma. And we have, for the most part, in my own language, it would be in a lot of modern industrial consciousness has a view of a relationship as between two objects, right? The other is an object, and I consider myself as an object. But I think our understanding of the nature of relationship already carries the collective trauma.
That's right.
We start off separate. Yeah. So I thought, well, what would be another way, another image of a relationship? And here's my image: is two galaxies merging. Now what's amazing about a galaxy? Like a galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy will merge with Andromeda galaxy in something like 5 billion years. But what's incredible is that the merging takes place without the stars colliding. a few will collide, but they're so far apart that the merging is without that kind of stellar damage, right? But what happens is that all of the gas clouds, not all, but many of the gas clouds in the Milky Way, in Andromeda, light up so that the merging ignites literally tens of millions of stars. And I thought, now that's what I call a good relationship, so that we enter into these relationships that light up these potencies we didn't even know we had, right?
Right.
But it's like they come alive, and so and all of us have had experiences like this, but we don't have a word for it. So the word I came up with was galactomerge. Thomas, this has been a wonderful moment to galacto merge with you, and I appreciate it so much, so much. Mm-hmm. Maybe we should turn now to our questions.
Right. One short comment to what you said is, before we go to the questions, is once, it's so beautiful because it's so correlated to what you said right now, is once I know that the Brian I see is not out there, but the Brian I see is happening in me.
Yeah.
In my perception. You are coded into my perception, into my whole history that made my perception what it is today. So Brian happens in my brain. And Thomas happens in Brian's perception.
Yeah.
So the merging of galaxies happens in the moment we meet.
Yeah.
But it's so important that if the more inside is outside, the more we increase and we pay attention to, we presence and practice and integrate the capacity to host each other in each other. If I have a fuller Brian in Thomas and Brian has a fuller Thomas in Brian, then we created an intersubjective cloud field. It's kind of equal to the gas.
Yes.
It's an intersubjective cloud field that shows us that, for example, myths like keeping a professional distance. When therapists or doctors, we say, okay, we protect ourselves from the suffering of our clients. Yeah, but how does this work if the client or the patient that is in the hospital happens already in my brain? It's a bit closer than my skin. And so how do I keep a professional distance? How do I protect myself from the trauma that I read every day on the news? When once I read it, it's happening already in me.
Yeah.
The only way, I have only two ways. One is to strengthen my capacity to relate and to mature it so that I have enough inner space to host it, to feel it through my body, my emotions, my mind, and to have enough space to know exactly what it means. And what it means is on all levels, and to find a relation to it. Or the other way is I need to contract and go into a state of inner stress in order to numb that part of myself that gets overwhelmed by that stress. There is no other option. The only option for a professional distance is fundamental relation.
Yeah.
That's the only way. Like maturity is the capacity to mirror the world inside. And that's, I believe, also a way not only for galaxies, but maybe also for our global humanity. Only when every one of us has the capacity to mirror the world inside, we will have a global consciousness. Otherwise, we have a lot of separation.
See, that's how we started, with that idea that when that happens, when we realize we are all inside of each other, we will have given birth to this new superorganism that Teilhard de Chardin called the noosphere. But it is it's a unity that we dream of, and that this work is all about.
Right.
The work of Sophia.
Beautiful, Brian. So maybe we look at some of the incoming questions. There are most probably many.
Here's one, Thomas. Let me read it. What would you suggest that small community groups could do as a practice to help process collective trauma?
Beautiful. Yeah. So if we summarize now what we said right now in this hour, we can boil it down to a few components that are really, really supportive. So first of all, if there is already a community group, it means we have enough people that have an intention to do so. So first we need to come together with the intention to take care of our legacy, because we see that taking care of our legacy opens our future. So it opens a brighter future for humanity to take care of our past. And so we come together, and then there are a few components: presencing, to have contemplative mindfulness practices, meditation practices, where we practice a deeper alignment with our bodies, our emotions, our mental processes, our relations. So presencing is individual presencing, self-contact, and practicing inner spaciousness, like witnessing awareness. And then Brian and I, when we attune to each other, when I feel Brian's body, when I feel Brian's emotions, when I connect to Brian's mental, cognitive process, and when we presence each other's relational capacities, so we create a nervous system's coherence. So when a community comes together, we can practice individual and relational presencing. And that's also what we can do, what we could do online here. If we came together on a video conference meeting, we can do the same thing also virtually. We connect to each other. We feel each other's group coherence, like our group coherence, and we feel each other as a group. And then we bring in topics, maybe first in smaller groups, and we look at what is the collective trauma of our nation or our area that we really want to focus on. And then we let people speak about their relation, first of all, and we create a coherence field. A coherence field means when one person shares and everybody is a participant in that person sharing. It's not just I'm an outside listener and I'm consuming your information. I'm an active participant because I know your part and your sharing about the collective trauma field and maybe how your ancestors or how you are connected and feel and think about it is a puzzle piece for me to learn more about it. So when I pay closely attention and I presence the person, I mirror your information in myself, and I see some sharings have more resonances, some sharings have less resonances with me, but I am a resonance body, like the body of a guitar. There's a string and a resonance body. We need these two elements continuously alive and present. And so the more we bring in the information at the beginning about the collective trauma, it will create inner resonances, physically, emotionally, mentally. And then we follow the process of the whole group and we stay present to each other. And this means that the collective trauma content can surface through us and get digested through us, through our presencing. Because in a way, a lot of healing work is actually digesting the undigested material that couldn't be processed at the time it happened. And one last thing is that it's very important not just to look at these things on a rational level or on a mental level, but to allow myself to become a witness that is also emotionally and physically present. And that I notice maybe some things are simply too much and I feel numb, I can't feel anything. So there, like, it needs some skill and also some maybe group facilitation to do that. But I see this as our future, that many communities around the world will start to take care of the collective trauma. It's like cleaning up the living room of humanity together. One day we will need to clean it up, so let's do it now.
That's great. Great. Now here's so this is the question from Paula starts off with a quote from you. When we heal a collective trauma, like slavery or genocide, we won't do it again, end quote. Thomas, is there an example of one trauma we have healed together?
Yeah, that I have seen trauma heal in individuals, and I have seen trauma, like collective trauma content, partly heal in large-scale group processes. So I have seen the integration process and how it affected the individuals when they were exposed to it again and had less internal kind of participation, so felt freer and kind of more liberated, and so could be actually more of a participant in it. And I'm sure that in history, but I'm not a historian, so I didn't make an in-depth research about all the collective traumas we had in the past and what has been healed. But we have to say, since it's still going on and happening, so it means that a certain depth of trauma healing on a collective level obviously didn't happen yet, because we are still in the after effects of creating more of it. And that means that when we speak about trauma healing, we are talking about reducing the after effects. And I think in individual trauma therapies around the world, we know more and more how to do that. And there are some pioneers that I think brought really good trauma healing methods in the world. So we can reduce the PTSD, we can reduce the hyperactivation and the numbing, and we can come to kind of a more functional and joyful and kind of expressive and creative life. But I believe underneath that there is a whole ethical growth, that an ethical restoration that is very important too. And I think there's a certain ethical correction that didn't happen yet in order to, for example, come to a deeper world peace. So this means that something is still missing. But it seems like through the healing that happened over generations and decades, or millennia even, because people practiced healing arts, for thousands of years, the evolution of humanity is progressing. So it means we released enough content in the past in order to get our collective evolution going. So it means that some things have been healed fundamentally, otherwise it wouldn't open some gates in the future. But there is still a way to go. But I believe through also technology and through the kind of intensification of the global community. So we're living basically in a global village already. And the very technology that we're using right now creates a much faster coherence building around the world. And I think we are going into a time where collective healing in a much larger way is about to happen on the planet. And so there is a chance for a deeper collective restoration that I think didn't happen before.
Let me jump to another one. How can we best participate on a daily basis to heal collective trauma? On a daily basis?
Yeah, on a daily basis, I think there are individual practices and the collective practices. For the collective practices, we need to come together in larger groups, intentional workshops or groups or gatherings, and dedicate that meeting in a skillful way to collective trauma healing. So I become part of a collective, and the we space is actually the healing power. And then there is the individual practice, which is kind of a complex process, because it means I need some kind of contemplative practice, because I need to strengthen presence, inner spaciousness, like my capacity to witness my process. I need a deeper inner body competence, which means that I'm more aware. That's something I can practice every day, multiple times. The coherence between my physical body, my emotional experience, my mind. And I do this over and over and over again in order, first of all, to have a faster access, to be more grounded in my life, access to my inner world, and to notice how often I am present as a whole human being, and how often it happens that I participate mentally in what's in my life, but actually I stopped feeling myself. So that, and that's when I meet all the places inside myself where I numbed myself. And when I'm numb, it's not a bad thing. When I'm numb, I'm just quietly expressing that I'm overwhelmed. That's why the traumatizations that we carry inside are actually our childhood heroes. They're not weaknesses, they're intelligent processes that I want to get to know. Instead of abandoning it even more, I want to include that part more and more and bring it back into an integration. So I can do presencing practices, I can do deeper attunement practices to my own inner experience. I can pay more attention how I relate. That I can, when I meet another person, I feel the person through my body. I look with my whole body. I sense with my whole body. It's not just a mental process. I sense. I'm there. And that creates over and over again nervous system coherence. And when another practice is the difference if I'm a consumer or a participant in life. If I consume, I'm walking around looking what I can get out of situations. Even when I watch a movie, I can be a consumer or I can be a participant. I listen to a podcast. I'm a consumer. Just what do you have to say? Yeah, but coherence is being built when I'm not just listening what you are telling me, but actually I'm participating with my creativity, which means I send energy back into the podcast, not by intention, just by my inner attitude towards life. I'm a participant as a citizen in my society, a participant as a parent in the education system. I'm not entitled to get. I'm a co-creative part. So that's very important. And then maybe one practice on the more collective individual level is that I believe we are all living in a time where at least most of us consume more information than we can digest. When I read the news, often I might read news feeds or headlines mentally, so I know what I read, I intellectually know what happened, but actually to digest the information that I read is way too overwhelming. So I meet the inner tension and tightness that doesn't allow me to digest what I read. We call this global social witnessing. It's a practice, and it's not that I should be able to digest everything. I just need to be aware of the fact that I don't. Because this means I'm not fully a witness to world events. If I cannot participate physically, emotionally, and mentally, like through inner coherence, in the information that I read, I'm only a partial witness. And that's inherently interwoven with the event itself. And so I see this as a fundamental collective trauma symptom that the interior of humanity cannot fully represent the exterior of humanity. There's an incongruency. And that incongruency is the amount of pain in our collective subconscious.
Here's another one from a different angle, Thomas. It's a little bit long, but it's okay. The more I dive deeper and draw closer to greater truths, I find it harder and harder to relate to people who are less informed. How do I create a nervous system coherence with this loved one when much of this person is frozen? What language do I use? It saddens me to feel separate from these people when this journey towards the healing, towards the light, is so beautiful.
Yeah, me feeling separate from other people has nothing to do with them. So whenever I feel distant or separate, or I don't find the right language, it's kind of my internal practice to see, okay, what's my inner experience when the healing of trauma, of course, needs appropriate relation, and often it needs kind of a professional relation. But it starts usually in my own internal practice with precision, which means in that when I say it's difficult for me to relate to people that are less informed, if I got the question right, then if that's what my mind says, it's difficult to relate to people that are less informed. And then I go and say, okay, I see that my mind interprets. There's the difference between understanding is coherence inside. Interpretation is an attempt of my mind to make sense of my experience. So that's, for example, Brian and I talked before about trauma language. A difficult moment, or for therapists, a difficult client, is a trauma language. Because there is no difficult client or moment. There is my mind is putting that word, and I'm not talking about criminal moments or life-endangering moments. I'm talking about when I say it was a difficult team meeting. I'm covering my inner experience with the word difficult. And so I can take this word, take it off like a lid, and then I look, what does difficult refer to? And difficult refers to an emotional inner state, and it refers to a physical inner state. So maybe I will find out that actually I felt ashamed, or I felt fear, or I was in that meeting, or I met this person that was less informed, and I actually felt numb. I hit the dissociated part in myself, and I feel in my body that actually I feel a bit tense. a bit contracted, or my solar plexus a bit tight. And so a difficult experience is when I take off the word, a composition out of very simple building blocks, a physical building block and some core emotion. And one of our practices can be to again and again dismantle my interpretations of my experience and go back to the most simple building blocks. Because if I say, oh, I felt numb, so I can presence my numbness, or I felt fear, so I can say, yes, I got afraid in that team meeting because I don't know, I talked to my boss and the boss said something critical and I felt afraid. So I connect to the fear, I presence my fear, I let myself experience that fear and relax back into the body. And if that's too overwhelming for me, so I look for Brian to help me to co-regulate. So I talked to Brian, I said, listen, my boss talked to me, he was very critical. And so I got really scared that I might lose my job. And that's what I tell you. And because Brian is a heartfelt, warm human being, his heart helps me to co-regulate my fear, relax back again, and then look at the situation new. So whenever there are difficult people outside, or for therapists, difficult clients outside, the difficulty shows me a part of my relational capacity that I can simply expand. And that's a great practice because that's a very self-responsible practice.